I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Jeremy Reese for a comprehensive overview of the emerging UAP story and how it relates to advanced propulsion research and development. Jeremy will be reviewing important historical points, as well as providing the latest information on the Pentagon UAP report and DoD Inspector General stories. Jeremy has been exploring concepts in UAP propulsion systems for over a decade and has built a massive online audience who trust and rely on his scientific and technology analysis.
So this is my technical briefing on UAP. It's adapted from the one I put together about a month ago for the Senate Select Intelligence Committee on, they have a UAP task force. And I put this together sort of for senators, and this is about my midway report through. And then when they release theirs in the end of June, I'll probably have another one with more edits and more things added or taken out, depending on what I think is appropriate for the audience. So this one's prepared for scientists, engineers, and innovators.
Now, Jeremy, it's showing your taskbar. I'm sorry for jumping in. Would it work if you went full screen with that? We could see the whole thing. And if not, it's not a big deal. Just thought I'd let you know.
Let's see if I can get. A way to.
I should apologize for interrupting you.
Yeah, I'll find a way to automatically hide the desktop.
There we go.
All right. Here we are. And I'll bring that out of the way too. So
my apologies, sir. Go ahead again.
Are we alone? This is the Drake equation. I think it's healthy to sit somewhere in the middle of this, not be extremely uncertain or extremely against the idea that we're the only, that there's nothing out there, or, and not completely certain that there's aliens out there and that they're walking among us, and that, there's a lot of different theories out there to explain the Fermi paradox. The idea that, that probably, with all probability, we should not be the only thing here. So why don't we see any evidence of extraterrestrials and extraterrestrial intelligence, or any solid evidence, anything that would convince our scientists anyway? They don't seem to be too swayed by these most recent US Navy UFO videos or any of that stuff. So it takes a certain level of proof and evidence to convince a true skeptic like this. So this is kind of what I put this together. There's a lot of different theories on this. Earth is a fishbowl, or we all live in a we're all basically a fish in a zoo, a fish in a fishbowl, or animals in a zoo, kind of like the Truman Show. This whole idea that there's a Men in Black, everyone's seen that movie from the 90s. Or the idea that, the aliens are like more like wallflowers. They're these, things that want to see and observe, but don't really want to interact or make themselves known. So there's lots of explanations out there for the Fermi paradox, which are quite interesting in themselves to explore. And but this is about UAP, and UAP kind of has an interesting history, unidentified aerial phenomenon. And I was trying to answer the question of whether there's any pre-technology sightings of UAP, and what pre-technology kind of means, and just how far back some of these technologies go. And I showed fireworks, and their fireworks date back to about 1,000 years to 1000 AD. But they had figured out Chinese lanterns. Of course, the paper making process and the ability to make paper lanterns goes back to about 300 BC, actually. Were first recorded in the Han Dynasty around 200 AD or so, with this general who used them, named and they're still called Kunming lanterns apparently. But they could have been, we talk about ancient technologies that could have been responsible for sightings. The first hot air balloon flight, of course, the French borrowed the idea from China of these hot air balloons, built a giant one day when they got, bored and got a bunch of their friends who had a paper making business to build a giant paper balloon. And they launched a chicken, a duck, and a sheep as their first their first experiment in September of 1783. And then a couple months later, they launched actually the first human experiment with and successfully landed it without, dying, and proved that it was, it could be done. And that started a whole era of ballooning, and, that of course led to some practical, ballooning technology. They used to have aerial balloon posts for military in the 1800s where, they would basically aerial command posts. They'd send up a balloon and you could see for miles out of one of these balloons. So there's also an interesting airship mystery about these ghost airships, and these airships that landed at a bunch of, well-dressed, wealthy men got off and went into town and bought a bunch of supplies and stuff, and then, went back out and boarded this mystery airship, and it flew away. And this whole idea of this NIMSA, or the Sonoro Aero Club, this guy Charles Delachaux, and there's some interesting stories surrounding this in the mythology that go back to the late 1800s if you look through the literature. But also in the 1800s, there was a author named Jules Verne who was sort of he was a science fiction writer who toyed with a lot of these interesting ideas, which were considered madness or lunacy at the time, sending men to the moon in a bullet. And of course, now today we know that those ideas aren't so crazy, because the children of those eras that believed in these ideas went on to actually build these things. And that's sort of what this presentation is about. It's about technology, it's about innovation, and it's about new ideas and resistance to new ideas. So when we trust the settled science, or the old ways, there's been a number of historical failures of imagination. Baron von Kelvin once said that heavier than air flying machines are impossible. He even wrote a paper showing with the calculations and the math how, it was impossible to create, heavier than air flying machine. And of course, they proved him wrong with the Wright brothers' first flight a couple of years later. Linus Pauling, more recently, he said there's no such thing as quasi crystals, only quasi scientists, and that was back in the 90s. He died in 1999. One of the great scientists, really an achiever and a pioneer in many ways in his field. But as scientists get old, they get so stuck in their ways that he just didn't want to believe that there was a new type of matter called quasi crystals, and he made fun of Daniel Schechtman and basically detracted him as a real scientist. And then, the last laugh was on him later on, as we'll see. But, it's still, the science is just imagination, but it's in a straitjacket. That's Richard Feynman, he said. So we have to learn the strict rules and adherence of science. Can't just be like Harry Potter, but it is imagination, but you have to understand these limits and boundaries, but still it takes some imagination to push those. Luigi Rota was pushing those limits and creating Jules Verne type airplanes back in 1913 based on ion wind and ion wind currents with electrostatics and electrohydrodynamics. Very interesting craft design with lots of propellers and very crude arrays. It would probably electrocute the heck out of you if you tried to fly it. Then there was Thomas Townsend Brown in the late 20s. He discovered this, asymmetric force and asymmetric capacitors, an anomalous force. And that was documented, and he tried to push that for a number of years. We'll talk about when he actually got into some laboratories and got some funding to pursue some of this research later on in this. But there was also Nikola Tesla, who had a UFO patent in 1928 and claimed to communicate with aliens and get signals and messages from aliens and all kinds of stuff. And Tesla used to claim so. But he was one of the greatest inventors who ever lived, and certainly an outside the box thinker who was way ahead of his time and talking about some really interesting ideas that were way in advance. But I think scientific cooperation and innovation is important. And, scientists hate UFOs because they hate not having answers. And Well, this presentation is about answers, so I hope we can, talk about some of this stuff and get real answers to these questions. Want to go in the timeline fashion. Everything's kind of in a chronological order, but we do skip around a little bit, skip ahead, and then jump back in this presentation. So we'll start with this Trading of the Enemy Act in 1917. There was actually this creation of an Office of Alien Property Custodian. And that was basically they'd confiscate property that belonged to enemies of the state during wartime, and it would go to this alien property custodian, and that's where it would all be held in this sort of secret office there. So they actually have an office that was created for this, and who knows, it could have been used to store actual, other alien stuff. But some of the laws that are important to be aware of is this international traffic in arms regulation, which is related to this trading with the enemy stuff, which is actual laws that exist, which could keep this stuff out of the hands of the public or out of the hands of, and even get it banned from the internet or taken down. So it's interesting to study this stuff and be aware of it when sharing and getting involved in this information. It's probably why we haven't gotten further with the amount of guests that have come to speak on this conference and share information with us. I'm sure there's some in the audience right now that have plenty of information that would violate these regulations if they were to get on here and share certain details of ongoing projects anyways. But I think it's important that we share technology and that we open these borders, because this technology is here. We're going to quickly realize how small this world really is, and the universe indeed, in the next couple of years. And I think it's important that we share these and are open about discussions on this technology, and that it doesn't become another hindrance or boundary towards, opening, further discussion on this, because this is an important topic and it needs to be discussed openly and seriously with other adults, and all information and all cards need to be put on the table with it. I really feel, and that's sort of what we're doing here. This is similar to what the Roosevelt letter did with Einstein and Szilard in 1946. In 1939, where they wrote this letter to the president, basically warning him of the technology that's about to come with this atomic weapons, and what the kind of future what kind of future world that was emerging at this time, and why they needed to invest in a Manhattan Project to get this technology. And I think that it's very similar to what's going on right now with the UAP disclosure and some of the technologies that we're going to cover in my presentation, because it's time for scientists and the world really to take these technologies much more seriously and understand that it's opening up an era similar to the atomic era that was opened up in 1940s with the Manhattan Project, where over 400,000 personnel were engaged in the top secret operation that was compartmentalized in such a way that most of them had no idea what they were even working on, or the greater scope of this project. They were just little integral pieces of a much bigger plan. So it goes to show you that this indeed maybe a Manhattan Project like this, it could indeed be going on today, and we wouldn't even realize it. But we're going to throw some UFO stuff in here. There was a Battle of Los Angeles in 1942. A UFO appeared off the coast of LA, and anti-aircraft guns shot at it. They shone every spotlight in LA on it for hours, and it did eventually it disappeared and moved on, but it stayed there for quite a while and spooked the heck out of wartime LA and the military. There were Foo Fighters that also spooked the military and were on record in reports. Very few were actually photographed, but much more were reported. Could be, again, real, some adverse weather phenomenon or balloons or something, but again, maybe something more. Glowing orbs of light. It's certainly a strange phenomenon. Then we had success with the Manhattan Project, and the World War II ended in 1945. it was peace, but it was also the Cold War and the weapons stockpiling. And we also took all the German scientists and we brought them over to the US and to a place called Redstone Arsenal. And we started a secret space program there with all the German rocket scientists. And this was really important for the history books. Immediately after World War II, we started working on supersonic flight with NACA, which was the precursor to NASA. And they first achieved supersonic flight in 1947. The Orbiter project, of course, came later, which would eventually merge in with Ames Research Laboratories to create what would be NASA in 1958. And NASA would run its own secret space program, as we know, called at Vandenberg Air Force Base, where they would launch NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, satellites into orbit, including the Hubble Space Telescope, which was really, nothing compared to some of the spy satellites that they put up that could take pictures of what's pointed at the Earth is much more important than what's pointed in space for the intelligence value of what it's worth. So this merged into the SDI program, which was an anti-ballistic missile defense program, and a whole process of weaponizing space with all kinds of directed energy satellite weapons and also other anti-missile capabilities. I think that recent video of the rocket attack in Hamas is a demonstration of where that technology, the epitome of where it's at today, now 30 years later. But we now have a Department of the Air Force that came out of this. I talked to some people in the Navy who've told me that this Space Force thing is basically just old technology from the SDI program that's being, updated and recycled for political purposes, and that's all they seem to think it is within the military. But all this stuff has its roots in Redstone Arsenal with General Holger Tolstoy and Operation Paperclip scientists. Apparently, I got to find originals of these. They must be higher definition versions, but you see that these are, the same backdrop, the same couple different people. This guy jumps in over here, but there's got to be photos of this. There's a couple of these guys that have their faces hidden. They're always putting their faces behind other people in these photos, which is weird, and they're not identified. So here's a list of all their names and identifications if you want to go back over this information later and check this out. But 3 of them, you'll note, are not identified. And it's interesting, there's a couple guys on this list that should be on this list that aren't there, that were later, confirmed Operation Paperclip people that might have been, one of these guys. I think that 22 is Hubertus Strughold, because he's not on the list, and it looks like his forehead, and that's all you can see behind the head. But anyways, it's just an interesting part of history that's still unsolved mysteries, that a lot of these Nazi German scientists came over and started this project, including, Hubertus Strughold, who did concentration camp prisoner experiments at Dachau with high altitude chamber testing, and all that intelligence was gathered by U.S. intelligence and brought back to the U.S. Air Force Medical Research Laboratories and used in their development of all the high pressure testing stuff that went into a lot of later Air Force studies and Air Force medical studies, which is interesting stuff. How deep the classification and the intelligence goes when it comes to this stuff post World War II. The Horton brothers are an interesting and worth mentioning, because they were developing some of the most revolutionary aircraft designs, which were very similar to what would be called flying saucers, as we'll talk about. The YB-40 and early flying wing type aircraft were really like some of the most revolutionary designs during the 1940s. They also go back to, as far as the 1929 to this Northrop flying wing. But throughout those decades of early aircraft development, these flying wing designs were predominant, and they were because they lacked a fuselage section, their radar cross section was virtually nothing. So they looked like a bird to radar, which was key for their natural stealth ability. And there's a whole list of these experimental wing designs and different shapes and different size aircrafts that were developed during these 1940s by both German and Allied forces. And it's also interesting to note that during about that same time, 1946, nuclear magnetic resonance was first discovered by Edward Mills Purcell. And Purcell would go on to, about a decade later, of course, right around the same time NASA was being formed, the CIA started Project Rainbow, which was their attempt to map out the entire EMF spectrum and create anti-Soviet radar coatings designed for the U-2 spy plane project. And this was the birth of, their understanding of metamaterials when they, made these artificial dielectrics. They discovered them post World War II. It was kept classified for a number of years, and it developed through these programs into nuclear magnetic resonance and resonant response. And but really, this metamaterial stuff, right, as shown here, didn't appear until like 2000. So this is much later. I can't find any evidence of C-ring resonators or these types of metamaterials until the year 2000, when John Pendry. And then we have acoustic metamaterials now, and even noise cancellation, a whole room that's super quiet because it's noise cancellation, like extreme. Then we have noise amplification through metamaterials. That chiral metamaterial of the cochlea inside your ear is what amplifies noise for your inner ear. Same thing that works inside a seashell, why you can hear all the airwaves so loud inside of a seashell. There's also chiral metamaterials, which is a whole nother type of metamaterial stuff we can get into. But John Pendry, he coined this term metamaterials, I think in the 90s. And then it wasn't until 2000 where he came out with the C-ring, split ring resonators and the Swiss roll. But he might have been developed in the 90s with the help of some of these people and kept classified throughout that decade. And then it was, because he was working on it like I believe the late 80s, early 90s when he coined the term metamaterials. And then it wasn't until 2000 that they actually showed how to build them and came out with it and stuff. So, but again, so this type of technology, which is key to producing the real type of invisibility and stealth, unlike these types of not real stealth technologies. Of course, they're also bending light, that they use these carbon nanotubes that produce such a heat on the surface that they can actually bend light around them, and it creates similar to what is called the Fata Morgana or the Flying Dutchman effect, where the ships over this temperature inversion, ships on the horizon can look like they're floating or stretched out like this. But there's lots of papers and literature on invisibility theory, but again, it all goes only back to about 2000, like 2000s, when the super lens, Pendry came out with that super lens paper, and that just is when it really took off. From there, the rest of it was all theoretical and a lot of guesswork before that. So, but it's gone to a whole new level. People are, creating invisibility cloaks for humans and all kinds of interesting stuff. And then now it's into counter invisibility, where the Chinese are developing techniques and radar systems that can actually see invisible or cloaked objects using entangled photons. So they use entangled photon pairs to check back to see if you're using one of these split ring resonator systems to basically cause interference with the photons, because it will break the entanglement of the photon, and they'll be able to tell, because it won't be the photon entanglement will be broken with the split pair that they create. But anyways, all this stuff we need to think about, because our current infrastructure, like the radio telescope and Arecibo, is deteriorating, and we need new infrastructure to listen and check the signals in space. We also need to think about whether we should be broadcasting our own presence, and do we really want aliens to come here, or to be inviting them? Because one of the things is, this wasn't just a big ear. Apparently, this was a big broadcaster and a transmitter as well, that we were sending signals deep into space, as well as trying to listening for a response back. Now, the signal presence that we produce with all their microwave antennas, some of this, it's argued that, some of this is necessary for long range and over the horizon communications. But there is ways to tune this stuff so that our far field presence, it won't be felt for far out in the universe. It will only kind of be localized. It won't be broadcast deep into space. So it's something to think about. And there's also something to think about. There's a Sky Hub who's they sell these devices where that you can basically monitor the sky, and it's all linked to a network where they can watch the sky for activity. And it's an interesting idea. But there needs to be some kind of stuff like this, I believe, with our senators or with the government. We need monitoring. We need data, because data would be key, and it would be super important, especially with all the data that those spy satellites could probably have and get on what's coming in and out of the atmosphere, and what's flying around up there. But back to 1947, this was like the peak year for UFOs and flying saucers in history. This is Kenneth Arnold. Just a few weeks before Roswell, he saw these boomerang shaped kind of craft at Mount Rainier, and he described them as flying. He said that they were skipping along the, like flying saucers, like a saucer across the water. And that flying saucer term, and that term flying saucer took off from there. And then, of course, it was used in the reporting from the Roswell Daily Record, where they said that the Roswell Army Airfield had captured a flying saucer on a ranch in Roswell region, which was in nearby Corona, New Mexico. As we know, if you know the story, they have this, they show up in Fort Worth, Texas. They come from Roswell, they fly to Fort Worth, Texas with this material. And when they show up in Texas, they came into the press office, and it's just a weather balloon, a torn up weather balloon. And they throw it on the office. They take a bunch of pictures of it. They hold a press conference, say, this is just a weather balloon, nothing to see here. And I don't know how they got it mixed up with a flying saucer, but we didn't get a flying saucer. There was no flying saucer. We don't know what you're talking about. And that was the end of that story, but it not really the end of the story, because it's caused a whole bunch of craziness, as we'll talk about and cover in this. It went up the chain of command from the base intelligence officer at Roswell Army Airfield to the base commander. Then it went to General Ramey, and then it went to General Craigie and Curtis LeMay, and of course to Hoyt Vandenberg, the head of the Air Force. And where might those materials have went? The alleged story is that they went from Fort Worth, Texas. They went to the Material Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And head of Material Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was George F. Shulgin. A couple months after Roswell, he sent a memo to General Nathan Twining on October 1947, stating that the saucers may be made with materials of composite construction that used various combinations of metals, and that were fabricated by unusual methods to achieve extreme lightweight. He also recommended that collecting intelligence on current whereabouts of the Horton brothers, the missing Nazi aeronautical engineers and aircraft designers, would be key to solving this mystery. So the Air Force, the head of the Air Force Material Command was, there's a altered version of this report, which makes it sound like he's talking about these flying saucers and different materials. But the composites that the Horton brothers were using to build their flying wing craft were composites. They were wood and glue, kind of like early types of plywood, actually. And they were a composite, and they were extremely lightweight, and they were built specifically for these types of aircraft. And this was the Horton Parabola, and the witness descriptions of this disc that was apparently out there is very similar to this Horton Parabola. I'd never seen this thing before, but it looks similar to the Kenneth Arnold sightings. of that craft, those craft that were seen near Mount Rainier. And here's one you can see like the Nazi insignia on the undertail section. Oh, this one looks like it was burnt. I don't know the whole story behind this, but this Nazi this parabola craft looks awfully similar to, you know, what was described at Roswell and also in the Kenneth Arnold sighting. And I wonder if it might have something to do with the Operation Paperclip scientists and all those Nazis that were working on, you know, top secret projects at the time, and in these areas, and why all these crashes. You know, it wasn't just this Roswell crash. There was apparently a couple other crashes all in this region, the Aztec crash and several others. Why they all take place so close to military bases is kind of another interesting topic. But it's also interesting to note that the acting head of Central Intelligence during 1947 in Roswell said that behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe that unknown flying objects are nonsense. And that's an interesting statement coming from one of the first heads of the CIA. The Roswell report, of course, came out in 1994 and said that it was Project Mogul and weather balloons, that, you know, there was top secret experiment on these weather balloons that was run by this guy Alvarez. And that was pretty much all there was to say about it. Then a couple of years later, this book came out by Philip J. Corso called The Day After Roswell, which shook things up a little bit in the opposite direction. This guy was a special assistant and head of the Army R&D Foreign Technology Desk. So he wasn't just a nobody. He was head of the Foreign Technology Desk, and he was saying that no, it was aliens that we recovered, and then we reverse engineered most of our technology from them, including fiber optics, the transistor, nitinol wire. But he doesn't talk about nanotechnology, and I thought that was interesting because, you know, I would expect that if it's alien and that advanced, it would have to be, you know, some really crazy nanotechnology. And so I did an investigation onto transistors and this whole stuff, and found that all the physics theory for solid state transistor physics existed going back to the 30s, you know, pre-Roswell, with this guy Walter Schottky, and that, you know, it's not plausible that, you know, the three guys from Bell Labs who created the first transistor, you know, got it from reverse engineering it from alien technology. It's very sound, and with the science that they got it through, you know, studying physics and solid state physics and electronics. And then I went on to this shape retention alloys and nitinol wire. This one was an interesting one, because you have this Bueller of the U.S. Navy Ordnance Lab who invented this nitinol wire with Frederick E. Wang in 1959. It was this one strange alloy of titanium that has these memory metal properties. And apparently the alien craft from Roswell was made out of this stuff, and that's where they learned it from. That one's more interesting, and we'll dig into that a little bit later in a second. When we dig into more, we'll get back to that in a second. But the fiber optics and the history of fiber optic cables goes back to John Tyndall in the late 1800s, who discovered that, you know, light through a water drop would bend, you know, would reflect from the surface, and that it would bounce around inside the bent water spout and reflect inside. And William Wheeler was actually one of the first people to use glass fibers to transport light around his house and decorate his house. He made like a whole decorated thing while he was in college out of fiber optics. Was one credited as like the first person to actually do fiber optics. And this was all before Roswell. So it can easily be argued that we didn't get these technologies from aliens, that, you know, there are more natural sources to this technology than aliens. The nitinol wire one we'll get into a little bit deeper. But the one thing that I didn't get is this description of these you know, people like Captain Robert B. McLaughlin and also, you know, Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer, talked about this metal-like fabric that was indestructible. You couldn't bend or burn it or break it, and you'd crinkle it up in a ball and it would bounce back into shape. And I've always found that story, particularly interesting. And the only material that I've ever seen or come across that could come close to explaining this is metallic glass and metallic glass alloys, which were of course not developed until in the 1960s at Caltech. And I thought that's, this is super interesting. If they had this metallic glass stuff, if they had this material back in the 40s, it was recovered at Roswell. Well, that can't really be explained by maybe the Horton brothers were working on this. Like, where did this come from? Like, was this a Nazi craft? Was this Nazi technology? Did the Nazis discover metallic glass alloys, 20 years before we discovered them at Caltech, according to on the record? And it doesn't make sense with the timeline for that type of stuff. So what amorphous metals are is metal structures typically have like a crystalline structure where they if they cool slowly, the molecules assemble in this crystalline structure. But if you cool them really rapidly, and it's different, that rapidity rate is different for different types of alloys. They did a lot of experiments in the 60s on those types of alloys, 60s and 70s. Really, the 70s is when the metallic glass research really picked up and took off. But as far as strengthening the elastic limit, glass alloys are the only material that could explain, these things with these properties. And of course, if you talk about these crystal phases, right? So regular crystals, if it's cooled slowly, it produces these ordinary crystal phases. But if you cool it rapidly, you'll produce these glass phases, and that's kind of why glass forms this, because it's technically it's still liquid. It's still not, or I don't know. That's the whole theory anyway. Someone disproved that, I guess. But in any case, a lot of experiments were being done in this throughout the 70s, and then in the 1980s, Daniel Schechtman was working on this while on sabbatical at Johns Hopkins University, and he discovered this icosahedral phase, which opened up the whole field of quasi-periodic crystals. So this is the quasi crystals. This is the idea of like ordinary crystals, glasses, and then this quasi crystal phase that they discovered when you cool the right type of alloy the right way, then you get this quasi crystal phase. And that wasn't discovered until the early 1980s. And quasi crystals, we found that we built scale models of these quasi crystals at Princeton, Eric Quinones, and he discovered that they were a more efficient way to bend fiber optic signals at 90-degree angles without losing any signal quality. And then I had a guy named Ed Fouche, who was a former Area 51 employee that came out in 1998. And I used to talk to this guy. I met him after doing a video on him, and he came out and contacted me because I found a video on him talking about metamaterials and quasi crystals, and saying that, these were, stuff that was heavily talked about in black projects out at Area 51 during the time he worked there in the 80s. And I was like, well, these things really didn't exist, in the public sphere until like the 90s and, the mid 90s, late 90s. And if he said he's working on this stuff out in the, the 80s on black projects, then it must be like super interesting, related to something. He says in one of his presentations that quasi crystals are the science of how the UFOs get here across such vast distances. But again, he didn't provide any proof or technical explanation to back that up. It was just a hearsay. But quasi crystals were very resisted, when Daniel Schechtman first came out with this idea in the early 80s. And Linus Pauling, as I said, this great scientist and chemist was, just lambasted this man and tried to bury his career. And then it took Linus Pauling dying and, other scientists discovering this stuff in the 2000s before, Daniel Schechtman was finally awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2011 for his discovery. So it's going to show you that you might discover something today and you won't win the Nobel Prize till 30 years later for it, because there's going to be resistance to your ideas. from the existing scientific community. It's just what happens, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't push on. But anyways, UFOs were used as a convenient cover for top secret US Air Force ops all throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s. The U-2 spy plane program, this was, started in 1954. They built this out. This is actually inside a hangar at night at Area 51. This picture, this is a Jeep outside. They're building and doing maintenance on the U-2 spy plane. They could take the wings off, fold it up, and load it onto another plane. This is a C-214, and then they could fly it to another air base. They'd fly it to another Air Force base, and then they'd set it up in a hangar and then fly it at night to keep it secret. That way, it wouldn't get spotted in transportation. They could just fold up the wings and load it onto another plane. But in a report also came out in 1998. It was one of the most read stories in 2014, and it was titled that the CIA and the U-2 program, 1954 to 1974, written by Gregory Pedlow and Donald E. Welzenbach. And basically the UFO and the CIA took credit for all of the UFO activity in the 50s and 60s and said, you'll check the flight logs, it was us, all these UFOs that were spotted are our flights and our craft and our programs. And naturally nobody believed them when they said that. But it's still an interesting idea that, what if it is like all us? I don't know that it is all us. But there were some official investigations that were done into this. Obviously, if it was the CIA, then the Air Force didn't know what the heck they were doing, and it was so outside of what was being spread around the public that even the Air Force didn't know, because the Air Force opened up several investigations of their own into UFOs at that time, and the main one, most famous of which, is Project Blue Book, and the H.P. Robertson panel, which was set up as an intelligence advisory committee acting under the director of Central Intelligence at the time. And they said that all civilian UFO groups should be monitored. And they also were, spreading explanations and tried to debunk a lot of the stories and tried to dissuade public interest in UFOs as much as possible through a coordinated campaign. J. Allen Hynek headed Project Blue Book, and then Luis Alvarez and Fred Durant were also members, and they were selected hands down because they were super anti-UFO people to begin with. So the CIA took people who were already like really against the whole idea of UFOs, and this guy was really pro science and really trying to teach people about science, and they had him develop this whole they basically spread years and years of hard work to put out into the academic institutions that, UFOs are just ridiculous. This is all hoo-ha and nonsense, and it's not something you should look into or take seriously. And there's nothing to learn here or really nothing to pay attention to here. And that was sort of the white face of Project Blue Book, where they hired all those types of people and put on that public image at the CIA. But in the background, it shows that the intelligence agencies were super interested in UFOs and were pursuing a lot of their own investigations into UFOs behind the scenes. And that was revealed in the Pinnacle Memorandum, which should be next slide. The Pinnacle Memorandum was it found in J. Allen Hynek's documents, which all went to Jack Valet when J. Allen Hynek died. And Jack Valet, when going through Hynek's documents, he found this Pinnacle Memorandum, which basically linked this guy Howard Cross to another secret Project Blue Book, which was intelligence collection for the Air Force and the whole intelligence establishment. It was sort of a secret Project Blue Book. And Howard Cross was, of course, the head of Battelle at the time, Battelle Memorial Institute. And Battelle was doing some interesting progress report studies for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the late 1940s, including complete phase diagrams for nickel titanium alloys. and back in the 40s, again, a decade before these things were discovered by the Naval Ordnance Laboratories. And they were doing tons of, evaluations research on titanium alloys, including a whole method for, dissolving titanium samples in chlorine and then measuring the off gases to figure out what what the alloy of titanium samples were made out of. So looks like they were back in the late 1940s, Battelle metallurgists, which was the top, defense contractor for metallurgy in the government at the time, were interested in analyzing samples of unknown titanium alloys and figuring out what they were. And so there's a lot of information that points back to Battelle as being a possible place for key information being held related to the UFO file, including the fact that they have a national laboratory management contracts on behalf of the United States Department of Energy for the following laboratories: Brookhaven National Laboratory, Idaho National Laboratory, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Los Alamos National Laboratory, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and the National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasures Center. So they have wide scoping reach over all the scientific institutions that, basically work for our country, which is a serious conflict of interest and a potential problem for, getting the truth out if it's all held realistically, if all the science is being held back and controlled by this one single entity and organization within the United States. That's an interesting thing to be looking into for our senators and our government, and also the scientific community, because that should send alarm bells across the entire scientific community when they see that sort of reach of and control over what is managed. That's a red flag for sure. The Blue Room is something that alleged to exist at the Secretary of the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Apparently there's a secret room called the Blue Room where all this stuff goes to. And Barry Goldwater, Senator Barry Goldwater, tried to get access to that Blue Room years back and did not get there. But as part of this whole Project Blue Book stuff, there was a whole division of the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This guy, Alfred Loading, he was a civilian engineer, and he worked on developing all kinds of saucer-shaped aircraft and testing them in wind tunnels. And, he wanted to know the feasibility. The Air Force obviously wanted to know the feasibility of saucer-shaped craft and, designs and know all the Air Force and research on them. So they hired this guy to build them and do a lot of testing on them. And he patented several, and they worked on several saucer-shaped craft. This was actually a Canadian company called the Avrocar, and this two of these were built based on the Kawanda effect to try to replicate a flying saucer, and it had a fan in the middle. And towards the end of 1958, Bonson Labs experiments, Townsend Brown, who we mentioned before, was getting into some classified research on his technology, to try to build a UFO or a flying saucer. And we have the video of that. I posted it to my YouTube channel, and it's quite interesting. And there's a lot of slides where they have chalkboard diagrams and stuff drawn on the board, and there's some really interesting stuff that's in there, including this one picture of an artificial dielectric with the layered materials of plus and minus. And it says right under here, barium titanate, and barium titanate. So it shows that during the 1950s at Bonson Labs, Brown was looking into these types of dielectrics and barium titanate and anti-gravity experiments, which is super interesting, because barium titanate is for certain frequencies can have a negative refractive index and can do some really interesting things. It can act as an optical resonant material and have some very interesting optical effects and electromagnetic effects. Of course, in this film, you can see Bryce and Cecil DeWitt come and visit Brown at Bonson Labs, which is super interesting because they were two of the early theorists that did the most research on quantum gravity. And, they were connected with some of the guys that were, connected to Einstein, like John Wheeler and such, and also Battelle. Bryce and Cecil DeWitt did a lot of work for Battelle as well. So at these Bonson lab experiments in 1956, these guys can be seen celebrating. They have vacuum chamber experiments, and then they can be seen celebrating with the people when they conduct the experiments. So there's a lot of rumors that they succeeded. And in the 1950s, there was magazines coming out, telling people that G engines were coming, that they were going to have anti-gravity soon. And there's a lot of rumors within the UFO community that we've had this technology since the 1950s. But then again, where is it? And why is no one at APEC able to produce this yet? And why can't we have a reasonable experiment that we can test in our labs if this was true? So we're on the hunt still and trying to explore this field with science. And again, there's no evidence for any of these materials that were ever, recovered from Roswell. They've never surfaced, but we do have some evidence that has come out for a 1952 Denmark case where a UFO dropped a piece of metal, and they actually have this. And in this other case, the Bob White artifact, where a UFO dropped a piece of metal, and there are samples of this that exist, and those might be of interest to anyone who's, looking into this. But it is certainly, the idea of where would UFO debris go? There's some people have said that, there was UFO crashes in the literature where the material said that was taken to Vandenberg Air Force Base and given to NASA there. And then some say it goes to this Wright-Patterson Blue Room. And then we have that, 1917 alien property custodian that was created that, we could consider that alien property, whether it's illegal aliens or what have you. It's reason to confiscate the property, and it's in law. And there's also an idea that, the Vatican's existed as this sort of place where anything outside the conventional explanation would easily have been confiscated and hidden in a vault, underneath the Vatican. And people said the vaults under the Vatican are quite extensive. So there's rumors that the Vatican might, be part of this cover up, and that maybe we are in that Fermi paradox solution that, this is some type of, the evidence is there, but it's been hidden from us systematically. We can't completely exclude that hypothesis. But again, it doesn't get us anywhere to go, trying to break into the Vatican vaults or beg for answers. We have plenty of answers, as you're going to see. We don't have to go to the, National Air Force Institute of Technology and NASIC and I'm sure they have some answers there of their own. It would be great if they could open up some doors and share and start sharing some information more openly with the public, because this is certainly where it would be. I've identified, if it's in the Navy, it would be at the Office of Naval Research, Division 351, at the Aerospace Science Research. And the guy who would know would be this guy, Dr. Knox Millsaps, if anyone knows. And of course, the CIA has their own R&D department, which is called InQtel. And Norman Augustine heads InQtel, and they would certainly have answers and know some stuff, as would the Air Force Material Command and the Air Force Research Laboratories. So all these people will probably have some answers for us. And again, Louis von Thaer, who the current CEO of Battelle, probably knows some stuff. Battelle has some stuff. And if it's not at the Navy with Dr. Knox Millsaps, then it's going to be in the Air Force with Colin Tucker. He would know. So again, if we want answers, there's people that have them. We go back to the 1950s. They have this group called the Majestic 12, which is the in the UFO literature. If you research the UFO history, this manual came out in the 80s, it was published anonymously. It said it was from April 1954, and it's a very interesting manual on technical operations for the recovery and disposal of extraterrestrial entities and technology. And it's kind of similar to what I would expect, the government would have in place, a protocol. We'd have to, imagine if aliens touched down or made contact, we'd have to have some kind of protocol in place. And this looks so much like a realistic, like what they would really do, that it took a lot of people by surprise. But it turned out that it was fake, and it was debunked a number of years later, even though, we have Colonel Arthur Exon, the highest, he's apparently the highest person who worked for the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson, to say that the Roswell crash wasn't what they said it was. And here he is in a German Messerschmitt, a captured one. James Forrestal was alleged to be part of this whole Majestic 12 group. He apparently went to Bethesda Naval Hospital and then committed suicide by jumping out the window. And there's all kinds of rumors surrounding Bethesda Naval Hospital and this MJ-12, and you can go deep down the rabbit hole with this on sometime if you want sometime, but I'm not going to do it here. But apparently some of these seem like real names of the people that would have been involved and would have been on board, but then others just seem like, this is made up, or that they put these people's names on there because they were active opponents of UFOs and they wanted to implement them in a conspiracy of some sort. But I don't think that this MJ-12 group was real, or that these documents were real, but I'm almost convinced that there must be a group like this that exists somewhere. And if there's not, then there definitely should be some kind of joint information center or an emergency, intelligence center to deal with this. Does FEMA have a a federal emergency management plan for if we interact with aliens, or if aliens crashed? It would be important to have this stuff made public and have a protocol set up, and to know where this material goes, so that the public can know about this stuff. If there is a secret operation that is in place and it does confiscate material from us and neuralize everyone who saw anything, right? But contact with aliens is something we've taken seriously. When the astronauts came back from the moon, we kept them in a quarantine in case they had alien microbes that they brought back from the moon, so we wouldn't all get infected with moon virus. So this stuff's real. There's got to be some, they had this project Moon Dust, actually was the name of this recovery project, and it was a wasn't planning for ET encounters, but there should have been a program like this. It was actually a satellite and space debris recovery program. So it was meant to, it was started during Sputnik, allegedly, so that if Sputnik crashed, we could go and recover the satellites and tell what, that, and get the technology from the foreign technology. So it's about foreign technology and artifacts of unknown origin. So we don't know if it's Russian or Chinese, but, again, it fits the whole bill of an office and an organization for recovering craft and analyzing them secretly. So that, I believe, is something that we need to look into further. The SOM UFO recovery manual, it seems very detailed and very well thought out and methodical, like a real manual. There should be a real manual like this. There should be a real team and locations like this in place if there isn't one already. And it should be part of this UAP task force to uncover that and disclose it and make it public. There's already people in the public that are, Jack Vallee's collected samples of alien, stuff that people have said, they've got UFO debris or pieces of Roswell or whatnot. And he collects this stuff and brings it to this guy, Dr. Gary Nolan, who has a bunch of scientific equipment where he analyzes this and takes isotopic ratios and all kinds of NMR and spectroscopy tests that he can run on these materials and to try to figure out their composition and what they're made out of. So, and then Bigelow, he expanded a whole section at Bigelow Aerospace to deal with, looking at UFO debris, hoping that the government would help, give him UFO debris to look at with his laboratories and stuff. And then, of course, they went and laid off their entire workforce back in March of 2020, thanks to Corona. And that never happened. But, there's places like this, people are ready for this in the public. And we'll go back to these cases. There's the biggest wave on record was from July 12th to July 29th, 1952. Project Blue Book got more reports than ever in their history during this Washington, D.C. UFO wave that happened in 1952, right over the Capitol building. And we had another incident in 1956 at Rendlesham Forest, the Lake and Heath Bentwaters incident, where this craft went down in the forest and a bunch of people saw it, and it was hanging out around, a nuclear base where nukes were kept and stuff. So there's a whole history of the Minot Air Force Base UFO case of 24th October 1968. UFOs actually went to a Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota and shot a laser into the ground into one of these nuclear silos and disabled one of these nukes. And they had to pull the nuke out, and it was in a whole official report. Several officers saw this UFO flying around and shining a laser into the ground. And some weird stuff has happened in the literature. Japan Airlines case, this one I think might have been this Russian blimp thing, because it was right around the same time the Russians were experimenting with these UFO looking blimp craft dirigibles. But there's also a lot of activity that goes on up here in Alaska, right around this area too. And a lot of people go missing in Alaska. It's a lot of mysteries here. So I'm not going to say I've attempted to solve some of them, but I don't think I have perfect explanations for everything, but I try to do it in terms of technology, like the Belgian UFO wave. We've done a lot of research into this TR3B Astra, like that Ed Fouche guy that started that whole TR3B story. And he insisted that the Belgian wave was related to this TR3B craft. Of course, there was a number of stealth blimps produced by Arion Corporation and Lockheed Martin, which they're not quite the same shape and the light pattern and everything else, but there could be other explanations for these sightings. Again, these are all documented in the UFO literature, and we just try to come up with reasonable explanations for them. I mean, if you see this dirigible airship, this is a new one that's being designed out in I think Russia, and it looks, if you saw this thing, you'd think it was a UFO. I mean, you'd think it was some kind of alien, but it's just a dirigible blimp. And again, there's these other big giant inflatable blimps that float around by this JP Aerospace company that could be responsible for a number of other UFO sightings potentially. NASA did some really big balloon satellites back in the 60s, Project Echo and the Pageos satellites. It could also easily be mistaken for UAP or UFOs. Then there's also this rumor of a Nazi Bell experiment that was going on in western Poland at the Project Reese, the Giant, it was called. And there's a whole system of underground tunnels where they were allegedly experimenting with this rotating Mercury and ideas about rotating Mercury. We've done some experiments with rotating Mercury, and we find that if you just rotate Mercury in the dark, it actually produces light. It produces its own light just from the physical movement that you put into the rotation. And I don't know, Mercury is an interesting thing. Of course, it's super dangerous and not easy to work with. But it'll be interesting if there's some connection here, because, the Nazi Bell is very similar to a UFO crash that happened in December 9th, 1965 out in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, where this acorn-shaped craft crashed and had these weird markings on it. And there's this whole rumor that it was related to, this GE research that was being done at General Electric with this guy, Henry William Wallace, and these ideas of kinematic effect or gravitomagnetism. This idea of rotating Mercury in a circle would create this gravitational field. And there's some history of this, superconductors and gravitational drag. There's a paper that I found from Bryce DeWitt in June 1966 that he published. So mid 1960s, superconductors, rotating, superconductors and gravitational drag. Might be some connection there. There's go through the literature of Project Outgrowth was the next big government U.S. Air Force propulsion laboratories interest in anti-gravity or anything kind of related to anti-gravity as far as advanced propulsion. So they did a whole study in the early 70s on that. Also gravitational control research by John T. Watson. He was did a thesis on that. Then in the 80s, they had this Alzafon Boeing anti-gravity research, trying to see if there was a match between spintronics and gravitation with magnetic alignment and entanglement of spin states. And that led to into the 90s with Project GRASP, this rotating superconductor experiment that was done by this Russian scientist, and then it was replicated by NASA and Boeing. And we've talked a lot about that. We've talked about these types of spin glasses, these types of spintronic materials, which might enhance these sort of quantum effects, which people now believe is responsible, because it's not just the rotating superconductors in the Podkletnov experiments, that he used a bilayered disk, and that layered two-dimensional layered material and the spin states that exist in these optical states is the key to how it actually works, according to a lot of what the physicists are now thinking. In the 90s, there was also this project Skyvault, late 80s at Rensselaer Polytech. They had a course on advanced propulsion concepts, and that's where this whole idea of using lasers to basically blast the air around you and propel you through the space with just laser produced pulses came about. And this guy Lake Marabou and John Lewis started doing a ton of research into that. It led eventually through the 90s into it was on TV and on like Future Fantastic and a bunch of other it was on an X-Files spin-off show called Future Fantastic, and it was on a bunch of other programs as well. But this lightcraft stuff merged into this whole idea of basically blasting and creating supercavitating weapons with lasers, so they could blast the air in front of the craft, creating a supercavitated air-induced injection, where this craft could basically, it would open up a vacuum in front of the craft, and you could just fly through it rather than the bullet splashing into some water like this. It will literally evacuate all the air or fluid in front of the bullet, so that the craft can travel through at supersonic velocities. So they can this apparently can do up to Mach 6.2 flow, but apparently they've got craft that can go like post Mach 10 or something crazy like that. So this is in the generation of Lockheed Skunk Works. This is the company that produced a lot of the top secret aircraft and research into top secret aircraft. And this research started with a physicist named Bernard Haisch at Caltech in the 90s. He wrote a couple papers on vacuum and generated inertial forces and inertial reaction forces, and how inertia could be produced through or reinterpreted through quantum vacuum fluctuations of this universal radiation pressure that's from all sides. And he was recruited by Caltech later on to go work for them, I guess, and bunch of interesting stuff that has come out of him. He did a documentary with Todd Bessiato. Maybe Todd could talk about that. Quinta Essentia was the documentary was called, and it was by a guy named Joffrey Deemer, and he also has a book of the same name, Quinta Essentia. And Bernard Haish is in that documentary talking about all these ideas for, I think it was in the early 2000s. And, this is when these ideas were brand new. And then that documentary never got like cleared for release because Bernard Haish decided, I don't know if he didn't want it to be published or didn't want to be part of it. And he was such an integral part of it that they couldn't publish it without him. But anyways, it never got published, but part of it's published on Todd's channel. And it's an interesting story about how, these scientists came up with this whole idea of space-time metric engineering, and, how can we reinterpret what space-time is, what creates space-time? Maybe it's the light itself that produces the space-time. And if you can warp the light enough optically, you might be able to warp the space-time physically. And if you can warp the space-time physically, then, how far can you warp it, and how much energy does it take? And can we create a propulsion system from it? And can we actually engineer it and build it and construct it? And there's a lot of work that's been done. Apparently, the Navy has been working on this stuff with Salvatore Pais and these US Navy patents that were revealed by Brett Tingley of thedrive.com, where he showed that the US Navy pumped tons of money into these PZT metallic coatings, where it was like a room temperature superconductor that could, and room temperature superconductor effects that could produce this space-time warping and whatnot. And then there's papers on this, going back into Defense Intelligence Agency. We find them talking about, schemes for creating negative energy states through dynamic Casimir effect, moving mirrors, and a variety of schemes using squeezed quantum vacuum generators, and a number of other schemes. So, cavity exciton polaritons and Bragg mirrors and these quantum wells inside the Bragg mirrors. Very interesting stuff with that's coming out in the physics community in the last 20 years related to this stuff. But it just shows you that if I don't think that we reverse engineered any of this from aliens, that it's all been it's all been a clear progression of our human ingenuity and our own human accomplishment in the sciences, and that aliens have been historically used as sort of a cover up for all this stuff. And the UFOs has kind of been like, oh, well, maybe it's aliens, when it's really just stuff that we're building. And I think it's time now that more people come to realize just what we're capable of building, and what kind of technologies that we have at our fingertips that are coming out of these black programs now, finally, I think 20 years later. But photonic circuits are definitely key. The idea of replacing all of our conventional electronics with photonics, and pushing photons around instead of electrons. It's a lot less. It's a lot less losses, a lot less heat produced, a lot less battery recharging. You could run it on ambient light, and it could just put it out in the sunlight to charge up your battery, rather than having to sit there and charge a battery and recharge your phone every so often. These dielectric mirrors, these Bragg mirrors, and these layered photonic band gap materials, super interesting as far as waveguides and the technology that can be produced in terms of photonics. 5D data storage, these quartz crystal memory systems that they're building, where they can write on quartz with lasers and do 5D optical data storage. It would be like the Superman memory crystal. You could literally store, quartz is stable for billions and billions of years. It will sit there in a stable form, unchanged, just like rock, pulling billion-year-old rocks out of the earth. It's really it's an incredible technology for storing information very small, compactly, and long term. So we're going to eventually build quantum computers once we figure out the puzzle of entanglement and how to not disrupt the entanglement. We're going to build quantum computers, and this will be a dawn of a new era we're approaching, it's been called the singularity by some, like Ray Kurzweil, And we're quickly closing what's called the terahertz gap in our electronics and frequency, where electronics meets photonics, spintronics, and entanglement. And once we close that gap, some interesting things will happen. I'll check that out. Images and tweezing. So we have 3D printing and micro 3D printing, which can go pretty small, but it only goes to a certain point, and then you can't really 3D print anything smaller than a certain level. So we rely on some other methods for like mesoscale models, atomic force microscopy, and tomography, and other ways of, X-ray diffraction, NMR, ways to, as things get smaller and smaller, it takes less and less force and more and more precise force to manipulate them. So if we want to build things on the quantum level and build, atomic 3D printers, we're just going to have to develop the technology and get smaller and smaller and get that ability pushed further along down the line. So we know that the U.S. Air Force and the research laboratories are interested in these Polariton condensates because there was a graduate student named Isaac Kemp who was arrested with 1,000 documents that he'd taken home from work, and they were apparently classified, but we know that he was working for the Air Force Research Laboratories and that he had his PhD in surface plasmon polaritons, is what he wrote his thesis paper on. So it's obvious that this has something to do with the technology that they're working on. Of course, we know that Battelle got the recent hypersonic weapons contract, $46.3 million contract to support manufacturing of materials for extreme hypersonic environments. So these materials that they're going to build these Mach 10 plus craft with, Battelle got the contract for it. Of course, if they've had access to alien UFO debris and UAP materials, then they know exactly how to build this stuff and have quite an advantage already. And so it's no surprise that they're the ones who got the contract. But I'm not saying that they have any such thing or that any such thing like that's going on. It's just a rumor. But hypersonics, the need for speed, is definitely something the Air Force and our military and everyone who's interested in defense should be studying and up on and know about, because these hypersonic aircraft and these supercavitating torpedoes that the Russians are putting out, and these supercavitating craft that can use these lasers to blast the air out of the front of them and go these hypersonic Mach 10 speeds are going to be the future, and they're very important to study and understand. And the future of laser weapons and laser sources are going to, with the advent of those Polariton lasing techniques, we can now produce lasers at much lower energies and with much better, higher intensities than before. So there's a whole new future of warfare to be made aware of, especially the railgun technologies. There's now railguns on our Navy destroyers and boats that can, fire wet rounds at 54,000 miles per hour. And then, of course, drone and drone swarm technology, another thing to be aware of. Definitely go watch that Slaughterbots video if you haven't watched that yet. It's a short film on a hypothetical future with these little drones that literally they're Face ID and they land on your head and kill you. It's pretty scary. Weapons in space. There was a warning that was put from Dr. Werner von Braun. He told his assistant, while he was working for Fairchild Industries, Werner von Braun told his spokeswoman and Carol Rosin that you must stop the weaponization of space, and that, where did he get this idea? I think he got it from going to Rand Corporation think tanks, but in hearing all the Rand Corporation people from the military industrial complex talk about, their plans and what they wanted to do and how much money they were going to make and how they're going to control the world and all that good stuff. And I think that's what he was warning to Carol about, that, we're going to weaponize space, and we're going to turn ourselves into Darth Vader and the evil empire. And if we're not careful, especially with some of the stuff that was going on in the military at the time with experimentation on humans. The MK Ultra project was, you know, just how far we can take mind control. You know, how far did the military take mind control? And they had this MK Ultra project, subproject 68, which was the radio telemetry laboratory, and they had a sleep study room where they conducted all these sleep studies on the production of sleeper agents, where they would play messages into your head while you're sleeping, and programmed people and did all kinds of experiments with mind programming and mind control, just to see what the extent of the technology was capable of and what they could do with it. And who knows how far they got, and whether they actually trained Manchurian candidate assassins and all that nonsense. But there was a project called the Montauk Project out at Camp Hero at the end of Montauk Island, the end of Montauk and Long Island. And it was a U.S. Army psychological warfare program, kind of a, you know, an extension. I look at it of Project Rainbow, with their mapping of the EMF spectrum and how all those different frequencies reacted on different types of matter. Well, they of course have different reactions on biological systems. So when they studied these reactions of these things on biological systems, they came up with all kinds of interesting things. In the 1960s, they discovered this microwave auditory effect, where they found that certain microwave frequencies would produce a clicking in your ear. And then they developed, you know, a way to basically take these transmitter noise and these energy envelopes, these little clicks, and make them all, you know, and send a series of pulsed clicks at different frequencies, so that they could make a voice appear in your head, in your head, the voice of God. They can literally beam voices inside your head. And they developed this technology, and we're working on it as, you know, as part of these programs. They also can shoot you with microwaves that make you sick and have some really bad adverse health effects. This Havana syndrome, that apparently this embassy in Cuba was targeted with such a weapon, they believe. And a bunch of embassy people at the Cuban embassy got really sick from this, what they thought was a directed microwave a weapons attack. There's also ways to, not only can they beam the voices in your head, they can all make you have auditory hallucinations. They can make you have visual hallucinations too. So there's this technology called HoloVect, and they do a triple beam projection that can it's way to project three-dimensional images in the air. And I believe there's a bunch of technologies that work on it for similar effects of producing images in the sky or images in the air, where they could fake a UFO, fake a plane, fake a glowing ball of light, fake a tic tac, who knows. But there's technology like this that exists. It's out there, and it's something worth looking into, especially if, you know, we're to take UFOs as a real physical phenomena, as I tend to say that I think this phenomenon is real and it's physical, and understanding every way that we could explain it is important, you know, including what the people that thinks it's a seagull. But I think a lot of this stuff's been going on out near San Clemente Island. It's a U.S. Navy base. It seems like there might be some experimentation going on. Maybe it's the Air Force testing out stuff on the Navy, or vice versa. There's other explanations. The T.D. Barnes was asked, he's a Project Area 51 Special Projects Manager, and weighed in on he was asked about, you know, what he thought about those Nimitz encounters. And he said that he was like, oh, it reminds me of Project Palladium, or the more advanced version, Project Nemesis, where they release these balloons from, you know, underground. They can release these balloons from submarines, and they can do interesting things with the balloons to make them look like fool and spoof radar, and also make them look like other things. And who knows, with that balloon technology combined with that Project Skyvault, that lightcraft technology, they could, you know, blast this balloon with some microwaves and send it flying, you know, across the sky, and it would glow like a ball of light. And there's some interesting explanations potentially. I'm not saying that this is what it is and that I've explained it, but it's worth looking in terms of technology to explain UAP and to understand UAP in terms of what technology exists and be aware of that technology. Project Nemesis, they can literally, you know, everyone's like clamoring about the radar data and that we want radar data from these things. Well, do you know that there's ways to spoof radar data and fix and confuse radar data too? It's worth noting. So stealth drones, there's this MP UAV that deploys from from a submarine hatch and can go out and fly around, and then it falls back in the water and collects back to the sub and can be recaptured. So there's, you know, there's craft that come out of the water, fly around, and then go back in the water. They also fire missiles. There's also balloons that look like UFOs. I mentioned those, but really finding answers and building the future is about, you know, physics has the answers. If you really ought to be studying physics and the engineering and the science side of this, because it's the best way, I feel, to get answers and to really understand this stuff. Quantum gravity is one of the most fascinating fields in physics right now. And, you know, if you crack quantum gravity, you've cracked anti-gravity and you've cracked all these problems. So it's a huge problem. It's not an easy one, and it's certainly one that is open for an invitation of new people and new minds into the field to come help us out. We also have the Apec Conference, which I'm speaking on right now, and the Apec Conference is a great way for to bring like-minded engineers and these types of people together to explore new ideas in physics like anti-gravity. Daniel Kaplan is one of the people working on muonium anti-gravity experiments to see if, you know, antimatter falls up or down. And that's a real question in physics. If we make antimatter, does antimatter fall up instead of down? Does it antimatter, anti-gravity? It's a real question, and one we hope to see answered in the next couple of years. Polariton condensates and laser emissions. This stuff I feel like is super important for the generation of negative mass and negative energy states that are much more easy to produce and less expensive to produce than, you know, protium or muonium or antiprotium, like antimatter hydrogen or some of these other antimatter molecules. But anyways, space-time metamaterials is a whole new emerging field of study in terms of these space-time skin coatings that can, you know, warp space-time or create white holes on the event horizon of the surface of these craft. And it might be ways to produce light, you know, faster than light travel portals, open holes and wormholes to new dimensions, and all kinds of interesting new physics if the next generation's smarter than us. What's in store for the future? Who knows? It's up to us, man. What do we want to build? Do we want to kill each other off and build, you know, maybe it's not up to us. Maybe we're going to do whatever the money says and wherever the money goes, because at the end of the day, that's what we need to survive. But I think the people that are in charge of the money and in charge of what's going on in the world right now need to really and seriously consider what is going on and what kind of future we need to build in the next couple of years. Because we're either going to die on this planet or we're going to get off it and explore space and be something greater. So we are most likely not alone in the universe. Summary of my points here. And we should take the potential contact with aliens very seriously in the near future. I believe flying saucers, this UAP, UFOs, whatever you want to call them, I believe they're real physical craft with engineerable propulsion systems. Whether they're ours or whether they're extraterrestrials is moot. But it's important that we need to look at them as such and just try to study them as such. Military and aerospace companies have attempted reverse engineering historically. That's true. They're looking for these types of things. Most of the public is convinced that this is just nonsense. They spent millions of dollars trying to figure out these problems. The majority of UFOs are likely man-made aircrafts. Okay, again, I say the majority, I don't say all, but I believe that a number of these sightings can be explained with technology rather than with woo-woo or whatever you call it. It's it's aliens peering into the simulation from beyond the dimensional realm. Anyways, it's time for the government to disclose and declassify. I fully believe this. I think it's time to come out with this. The public can't handle the truth. The internet's going to leak it regardless. And it's just time to, be honest and open and make all this stuff above table. And finally, I think the physics and the discussion of the technology will spur innovations of tomorrow, and that it will likely create solutions to our current problems that we're in. And that's all I have to say about my summary. I hope you guys liked it.